What's up? What's up? What's up? Excuse me for coffee. It's Monday. And if it's Monday and 8 o'clock, it must be Real Talk. And it's so great to have you. It's Holy Week. Yesterday was Palm Sunday. And we're closing in this week of Good Friday and Easter following. I'm excited to be with you because we were discussing today and we just realized today is the first anniversary for Real Talk. We started a year ago this time. And we got some incredible guests with you for this tonight. And I'm excited about this conversation. So let me just, before I start introducing people, let me just say a couple of things. Tonight, we want to entertain your questions. So if you wouldn't mind, in about 30 minutes, jump in and you can post all of your questions on Facebook or on YouTube, and our technicians behind will make us available, and our panelists wants to engage you over this issue. Now, we kind of got out of sync a little bit. We were doing every other week, and right now we're really concerned about having great quality conversations, instead of just pushing the program through. And for weeks now, I've been wanting to have a second conversation about anti-Asian racism and hate in the United States. And I felt like it was very important. So I was trying to finagle how many relationships and friends I can get on this. And then unfortunately, on March 16th, my youngest son's birthday, a tragedy happened in Atlanta where we live. And on that day, a number of Asian American women were killed. Well, we want to talk about that incident, and we also want to talk about what happens after this time. We got a variety of guests with a variety of skills that we hope will be helpful to you. And as the Impact Movement, we want to communicate to you that the scripture says in Ubuntu, I am because you are. And that's not just to Black people, that's to everyone human. And so we have to have this conversation in the Impact Movement because we feel so dearly connected to our Asian brothers and sisters, and we love them dearly. And so I hope tonight this would be something that is a comfort for everyone, and that's our desire, but also we can give you some ways to be proactive. So having said that, thank you so much for joining us again and being with us for a year. So let me just start off. First, I'm going to introduce one of our newest guests. Her name is Reverend Sabrina Chan. I met Sabrina when she came on staff with InterVarsity in Texas. There's Sabrina. How you doing, sis?
Doing all right. Glad to be here.
And she's been moving all around the country, and she's changed some roles from area director, and then she went to California. Now she lives in Durham, North Carolina. Let's be clear. It's not Raleigh. It's Durham. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. That's right. Definitely Durham.
And she is the National Director for Asian American Ministries within InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. So it's great to have you, Sabrina. Thank you.
So glad to be here, Jimmy.
And then another friend of mine, she's in Chicago, right on the lake. I think spring may be coming in the next 4 or 5 months, but her name is Jen Oyama Murphy. There she is. She's a returning guest. If you guys remember, she was with us when we had the Seattle school, and we were talking about trauma that whole evening. Jen Oyama Murphy is back with us. It's great to have you back, Jen. How you doing?
Good. Thanks, Jimmy. It's good to be here. Thank you.
Excellent. And then now we have Sam Lee. Sam Lee is in Austin, Texas, and he is a therapist. He's connected with the Seattle school, but he has his own private practice. Hey, Sam, how you doing?
Hi, Jimmy. It's good to be here.
Thank you very much. Good to see you as well. And you can show everybody you're drinking something. I got something too. So and then last, one of our very first guests from a year ago is back with us. He's a friend. I started thinking about this. I've known Sabrina Chan for a little while. I'm not going to say I met her when she was 12, but for at least, oh my gosh, almost 20 years, if about that time.
So.
And I met Soong-Chan Rah in 1998, and he's here with us again. How you doing, Professor Rah?
Hey, good to see you.
Good. It's good to see you again. And so he's in Chicago as well at North Park Seminary. And it's great to have all of our guests with us tonight. Well, as I was sharing with everyone, getting prepped, March 16th, my son's birthday, was the evening or day of horrific events in Atlanta. Yesterday, the Asian American caucus from the House of Representatives was in Atlanta to retrace the steps of the perpetrator. And just like we talk about incidents of where were you when 9/11 happened, where were you when another thing happened, I want you tonight, each of you, just to share where were you when you heard these events, and then begin to express to us your emotions. And Sabrina, since you're the newest one here, I want to start with you.
Sure. No, thanks, Jimmy. Appreciate that question. I was online watching Chanel Miller, actually, who's an Asian American sexual assault survivor. She was talking, she wrote a book called Know My Name, chronicling her story of being raped on campus at Stanford, and then over time sort of sharing her story and what that was like and what sexual assault survivors go through. And I had been seeking out like spaces to hear from Asian Americans, just with the rising racism. And so her thing was beautiful. It was inspiring. It was wonderful. I logged off that window, and right behind it was my Facebook or something. And I saw someone post, and immediately it felt like that inspiring, empowered feeling just got sucked right out of me. And just started looking for more information. But I mean, clearly it was already reporting 6 Asian women had been shot. And I just knew, this is racially motivated. There's only women, so I think it's gender motivated. I didn't know what was happening, because I saw Spa and I thought the idea that somebody would be thinking about sexual temptation wasn't in my brain in the moment, because I just went to a spa recently and got a foot massage, like that's just what you do, an Asian spa. And it was tough trying to find the information, but really it wasn't until after my husband had also gone to bed and I was downstairs by myself that I could really even feel the feelings, and I just wept. Like I lost it. I think after it was quiet, after the kids are done, like I could just sort of be, and I wept for the victims, for sure, for their families, for their communities, for Atlanta. But I also wept for myself and just the like what I have to do to walk around as an Asian American woman in this country that I've had to do since I was, really little, when I became aware of it. I try and keep that at a distance most of the time, right? I don't think about it, but in that moment, that night, it was all there, and it was tough, but I also felt like Jesus met me in my vulnerability in that moment. I think the thing that I heard was Jesus knows vulnerability too. So that, that's that night. Since then, it's been like, I've been all over the place. So I'll just stop there and let others share too.
All right. I want to go with Jen and then Sam. You guys are therapists. You work with people about trauma care. And I think sometimes people think you guys are so professional that you don't emotionally engage. So Jen, tell me emotionally, when you heard the news, where were you? And emotionally, what have you been feeling about this? And then Sam, you're next.
I heard it because I was getting a text in the middle of the night, which anytime that happens, I think there's a shot of adrenaline that goes through. But it was my younger daughter, who usually does not text me in the middle of the night, and she didn't really leave a message. So then I started looking at my phone and texted her back, and she let me know what happened. And I think my mother instinct probably kicked in even before the feeling for myself. But as we know, kind of in trauma work, when you experience something traumatic, it links back to every other trauma that you've experienced. So all of a sudden, stories after story after story, I think, started coming to me of trauma that's happened to friends that I know, to myself. I started thinking of my aunties, my mother, my grandmothers. It all started coming, and I was up most of the night. And then, like my generational Asian training taught me is when I feel something deeply, what I do with that is channel it into being productive. So I got up the next morning and I just started cleaning and doing laundry. And for me, that's the way that I know how to contain and channel emotions that feel like are just gonna overtake me. And I think there's this sense of, if I let myself drop down into the fear and the grief that I feel, it is gonna overwhelm me and take me out. And I think that sense of feeling like, as an Asian woman, I'm often invisible. And so if I'm in that state where I'm in that sense of such deep grief and anguish and nobody sees me, that is even worse, right? That's going to confirm for me, I think, one of my worst fears, and that sense of loneliness. So the choice to kind of contain and be productive, to avoid that, even though I specialize in trauma and I know if I step back, I know what's happening to me, I couldn't stop my body from doing it as a way of trying to protect, I think, my heart.
Wow. Sam, go ahead. Now, I think I should mention that, you are a guy, so it's the whole idea of what happens with you in this process. And I think you have a daughter too. Am I correct?
Yeah.
So tell me some of your feelings as well, Sam.
Yeah. I think leading up to March 16th, as a family, we watched Minari, and a beautiful, beautiful story and movie that just made us feel like really connected, and really proud of some of the Asian American like stories and movies and representation, and the vividness of the story and uniqueness gets to be on that stage. So there was like a moment of pride, and then I get a call from my brother, and how he's dealing with my nephew, who's 4 years old, learning and starting to enact these different gestures because he learned it from his school. And so you're talking, just some elation and then deflation. And then similar to Sabrina and Jen, I saw it on my phone, and my initial response, just the headline, I just scrolled up again. Like, it was too much to bear to have to see and actually read it. So I think this speaks to when we are in trauma, we have different ways to respond. It might be fight, it might be freeze, it might be where I just went numb and detached, because that was, in the brief moment, that was my way to cope with that. Yes, afterwards I did start to step into it, but I felt the overwhelmness of the moment.
Wow. And Soong-Chan, you and I we met because we were trying to deal with issues of racial conflict in 1998.
That's right.
So I'm going to ask you where you were and how you felt, but some people think because we've been fighting this for so long that we got tough skin and that this stuff doesn't really affect us because it's just a part of our job and purpose.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's true. So why don't you share with them too how you felt?
Yeah, I mean, the pain was definitely strong and acute, I think. Remember hearing the reports, and I actually heard it the old-fashioned way, which was I think I might have had my phone off or not had access to my phone for some reason, but I heard it through like conventional media. And the reports that were coming out were just so disturbing because it was very early on. If you recall, they were kind of identifying these victims as sex workers or as, the sympathy was with the shooter. Oh, he had a sex addiction. He had a bad day. And so that was just infuriating. And just I think I channeled it towards my anger to say, this is insane that a mass shooting has occurred. And already the narrative is, let's empathize and sympathize with the shooter. I think where it hit hardest for me emotionally was actually like a day or two later, and this was on social media, where they actually put the Korean names and the ages of the women, particularly the Korean women. So the first, I believe, was two Chinese women, or a Chinese American woman, and then in the next two, it was Korean spas, and there were four Korean American women, and they were in their 60s and 70s, and that was just crushing to see their names written in Korean. 73 years old, 67 years old, 63 years old. That was just devastating to see, and it really hit home personally because I lost my mom this past year, and she was maybe typical of that generation of immigrant parents, where many of our immigrant parents who were non-English speakers, or who just, my mom was a single mom trying to keep her family together. So she ended up working a lot of jobs that were anonymous. She was a short order cook at an inner city carryout. She was a nurse's aide at an inner city nursing home. Those are not the kind of jobs where you remember their names. It's just, hey, you, and so when those names were put up there and we found their identity, that was really emotionally hit hard for me, because my mom in many ways was, didn't do the job working at a spa, but she was in the service industry. And she would have been one of those older Korean ajumas who would have been anonymous in society. So there was that real raw emotion that was felt, because this really hit close to home. A Korean immigrant mom trying to do whatever she could to keep her family together and feed her kids. And she was gunned down and had remained anonymous. And that was very painful to see.
As I think about today, today has a lot of meaning, not just the anniversary, but today is when George Floyd's trial starts. And already they're trying to also build a narrative, again, that further criminalizes the victim, so that somebody who created this. So this is something in terms of trauma, what you were saying earlier, Jen, that we connect in the African-American community. It seems like it accumulates and it builds momentum. So here's the next question. So what, audience, I want you to start getting your questions together, but what I'm going to try to do is take advantage of each of the panelists and their specialty and their careers, their passions, because I think it's their passions. This is not just their 9-to-5 gigs. So I want to do something cathartic. And I want Jen and Sam, if you can begin to help our audience interact with some tools to think through emotionally, how can they process coping with this in a healthy way? And I want to introduce a word that in my small years of interacting with the Asian American community, this issue of shame, because I feel like shame is also a component with this grief and this anger and this frustration and all the emotions that you said now. So Jen and Sam, give us some tools. Sam, if you want to start first and then give it to Jen, we could do that, whatever. I'm okay with it if you're okay with that.
Sure.
All right, go ahead.
Well, I think one thing I do want to point out is that if you're on this, then you're probably on some social media platform, and there's so much resources that people are putting out there. And I think those are really, really well. But I think one thing I do want to speak to specifically is we do, as Asian Americans, do need to speak up, join protests, join rallies, understand the collective trauma, the collective history of why this is happening. But often, I think, particularly with Asian Americans, we get into our cognitive mind about educating. Or we need to look at our other counterparts and say, well, we need to protest just like there. And we're striving to just have a voice, but we're trying to do a voice like our African-American brothers and sisters, like other people that have done it. And I think one thing I'm hoping that we can really pursue is, are there actual reflections of what protest looks like that bears an Asian face? I think of right now what's happening in Myanmar. If you could just Google it and just look at the pictures of the civil disobedience movement, it is powerful.
Mm.
I think when I watch what's happening in Hong Kong in the umbrella movement, like there are Asian representation of what that can look like and what a collective voice could look like. And I think we need imagination of that instead of being like this or like that, and we're not doing it like this, because that's constant conversation around being invisible. Is we need to step up and do our part. But what is our part? What actually gives us imagination for that? So I think that's something I want to highlight. The other part is how you self-care. The thing with trauma is you lose language. And if you're second generation, 1.5 generation, third generation, you are disconnected because of immigration, because of being refugees. Like you lose connection to your broader story. So it's hard to just in the moment like know what you're feeling, know why you're feeling this way, unless you start to reclaim some of those stories that you don't have access to. And we have this connection to our ancestors. So some of the self-care is not just learning. I think it's always about education. It's about how that connects to your body, to your story, and how do you start tending to that? So those are just a couple of things I'll bring up initially.
And Jen, why don't you kick in? And you got two things. You got a therapist, but you're a mother of 2 daughters. So give us some imagination of how you can encourage the audience and everyone of how they can process this sort of trauma.
And I love what Sam was saying about thinking particularly about your story, your family, your faith, your culture, and not just kind of mimic what you may see online or out there, which tends to be very Western. I think even in this idea of sharing story, that for the Asian community, when you share a story of pain, you're not just, I think, stepping into your own pain. You know that your sharing of that is going to create pain for your family, for the people that love you, for your community. So there's a collectiveness that happens in the sharing the story that I think can feel like an extra weight or an extra responsibility. And so I think having a lot of kindness for it, it may take a while to find some safe spaces where your story also isn't being consumed as some sort of like spectacle for other people.
Yes.
Where you get to have a safe, contained, probably smaller space. I think too, our stories don't have to be in the English language. To tell your story in the language that your body naturally speaks. And like for me, that language can be food, right? That it could be, I need to be sitting at a table eating sushi and sipping tea, and that I can let the story come out slowly over a meal. For some people, it may be music, it may be dance, like to let your body tell the story in the way that it wants to and not feel confined to the English language and the way that we understand stories. So I think that's something, there's been so much research and work around body work being so important to trauma and having a sense of self-care. But right, even that for Asian women is tricky. Right, that there's something about being an Asian woman, having an Asian woman's body and being embodied that has been hypersexualized, and that it actually feels really dangerous and exposing to be in my body and do the body work that cognitively I know is really good for me. But especially in light of the Atlanta murders, the request of me, or that I make of myself, to like be embodied, to do some yoga, like I can start to do that and something activates in me, like this is wrong, this is dangerous, your body is dangerous. Like all those messages that we get as Asian women that hypersexualizes us and can make access to something like body work, which is so good for us, feel inaccessible. So again, I think just having a lot of kindness for ourselves in terms of what we can access and when we can access it, but that's okay. We may need to go slow, which is, again, at least for me as a Japanese American woman, slow is a good pace for me, and for me to not pressure myself to like be over it or understand it quickly.
So as audience, as you can see, we say Asian American, but that's a huge umbrella.
Yeah.
And I want to tell you how eclectic our audience is. Soong-Chan Rah is Korean. Jen has already told you she's Japanese. Sam, you're Chinese, and Sabrina, you're Chinese. Am I correct? So I want to make sure from Hong Kong. So I want to make sure everyone knows how eclectic. And then if we get into the spaces of even their ethnic group, it's very eclectic. So we should not just assume that it covers that swath. And I'm going to do this just one time, I promise you. But I knew a year ago when the term China virus was coming out that no one in this country knows the difference between someone Chinese or Japanese. And so that meant everybody, and that includes Filipinos, Vietnamese, everybody from Southeast Asia were now victim because of this kind of language. Now, I was thinking about the four of you, and you guys actually represent what we're trying to do in the impact movement. We're trying to deal with trauma. And then Sabrina and Soong-Chan, y'all both together represent what we're trying to do in content. And so now I want to shift a little bit to you guys. So Sabrina, you're the director of Asian American Ministry. And so I know what I feel. I think you have the same thing. You, in your hand were staff and students, one at each hand. And how long did it take you to start thinking about what did you have to do for your staff and students? And did you do anything during that time? And then I'm coming with you next, Soong-Chan, about theology. Go ahead.
Yeah. It took me about 10 seconds to think, oh man. But partly because we'd already been doing some stuff, right? With the rise of Asian elder violence in February, we had held 2 processing times just for staff because we were trying to get safe space, and about 75 staff came through to help folks just even share what they were feeling, how invisible it felt, because at that point mainstream media wasn't reporting much of anything, and just a place to share the pain. And so we had done that in February and had put together a little bit of a guide for folks who were trying to do that with their students. And then as soon as, March 16th, the shooting happened, it did feel like, well, what else can we do? Because I already did the processing space for staff. I don't know that that's going to be, but what I felt with my team, we discerned, I think there's just going to be a lot, folks can gather in their smaller groups and regions and ethnic communities for more processing. But we really wanted to create space for staff to bring their feelings or lack of feelings, right? If people were feeling numb, bring those to God. So we actually invited some Asian American spiritual directors in our movement to start hosting some space. We're calling them spiritual care spaces. So for like 3 staff at a time to meet with a spiritual director to just say, what are you feeling or not feeling? What do you want God to help you with? Those kinds of questions, because it felt like a lot of staff are also going to go into like, what do I need to do for my students, or what am I going to do here? We wanted to create some of those spaces. And another big thing has been just continuing, especially for students who may not, and some staff, right, who may not be as connected, trying to connect history to all of this. Because I think, because so many of us have come post 1965, including my family, my parents, in the Chinese American community, I'll speak for that, just are not connected to the stories of Chinese Americans from the 1800s, because if you didn't grow up in, say, SF Chinatown or something like that, where there is a strong history, it's not taught in schools. My parents don't know that story. It wasn't until 10 years ago, I was on sabbatical in Hong Kong, hanging out with my gulma, my oldest aunt. She told me that my great-great-grandfather worked in California. And I said, what? Dad, you never told me that. My dad's sitting right there. He's like, I didn't know. And I was like, you didn't know. And so we did the math and we were like, figuring it out. And I was like, he had to leave because the Exclusion Act, I think. He probably came back to the village and then couldn't go back because he went in the 1870s and worked in the fruit orchards. So we just don't, a lot of us don't have a connection to that history. And I think, I didn't learn about Japanese American incarceration until after college.
Oh, wow.
I had to learn about it on my own. And immediately after that, I just started reading, right? And I was like, wow, this is, I know America sees just as just one race, right? And so I know how racialization works. So I got to learn about this. And so trying to connect the history, you were asking about what we're trying to do. So I think we're also trying to not just be, because we're tired, it's been a whole year of this. Last spring, we did a bunch of webinars to try and help equip students to resist anti-Asian racism. So to think about, like, what will you say if and when someone says something to you? Theologically, how do we think about that with, what does turn the other cheek really mean? And, like, is it okay to stand up for your dignity? And we said, yes, very much so. And some of those things, but we're tired. And so there's a bit of, like, also, how do we also think forward and be proactive, like you were saying earlier, Jimmy? So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the truth of the matter is the hardest thing for all of us, even in teaching people this, is that the disease has prevented us from embracing each other, from holding each other, from feeling the tears of each other, and to give the added comfort that would normally be available for us makes this even harder in our own isolation. Yeah. Soong-Chan, I want to come to you now because you shape people too. You actually shape pastors, whether it's in the DMin program or they're going through the MDiv program. And one of the things that came up yesterday, I was in a rally and someone started talking about toxic theology. I told you I was going to bring this up. I want to bring it up again. And I think there's something toxic. And I'm not sure we know this. In Impact, it's been 3 years trying to decolonize us and to deconstruct our faith and come with a healthy theology that affirms our identity and embodied faith. So someone said yesterday, we want to get past toxic theology. And then they said, well, right now we're before everyone as Christians, and then secondarily we're Asian Americans, almost creating again this bifurcation of what does it mean to be fully embodied. So as a theologian, as someone who's been years working in this as a practitioner, as a pastor, but also as a speaker, a writer, talk to us about toxic theology and how you think people can pivot theologically.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different vocabulary around toxic theology. I've used the phrase cultural captivity. My mentor uses the phrase diseased imagination, diseased Christian imagination. There's a lot of different kind of terminology, but they allude to the same thing, which is that theology has been misappropriated, misused. It's captive and serves Western culture and is derived from that more than even the scriptures themselves. It has created this diseased imagination where you see the world through a particular lens, again, and that lens tends to be socially, culturally driven, usually by power dynamics. So it's the dominant culture, it's the culture with the power, it's the people group with the most power, and then the rest of us are kind of forced into that mold. And that's what toxic theology is, which is the culmination of this diseased imagination, this cultural captivity, and it results in a form of Christianity that reflects more the dysfunctional, diseased values of the society rather than the Word of God itself. So there's some really good writing on this. I think Kristen Dumez's work on kind of Jesus and John Wayne, kind of the toxic masculinity that has infiltrated evangelicalism. I write about the hyper-individualism and consumerism. In my book on lament, I talk about the exceptionalism and triumphalism, which is very much a part of the American narrative, and it becomes a part of the narrative that becomes toxic theology. So a lot of these, though, if you look especially at the American cultural dynamic, you'll notice that one of the key themes in toxic theology, culturally captive theology, or diseased imagination theology is that it tends to center the dominant culture group as the reference point for everybody else, right? So, and I think we talked about this before, that usually what you'll get in this is the lack of an adjectival describer for things that are actually coming from Western white culture, right? So it's never, Calvin is never Swiss theology, or Luther is never German theology, right? I mean, yeah, you're laughing because nobody
it's the
calls
truth.
it that. It's
That's
just
exactly right.
theology. But Cone is Black theology. And, but Andrew Park is, Korean Minjung theology. And such person is a womanist theologian. You give adjectival describers to things that is not considered normal. It's not considered central. And so some of the toxicity is not just that you've created a cultural dynamic around your theology, which is inflected in a particular cultural norm, but that you can't even recognize it as such. You can't even recognize, oh, this is very hyper-masculine theology. We just say, oh no, that's the way evangelicalism is. Oh, this is hyper-individualistic theology. Oh no, that's a hallmark of evangelical Christianity. We focus on the individual, not on society, not on social issues. So if there's a remedy for that, it's to actually begin to explore and be in conversation with other, perspectives. To recognize that yours is not the only perspective on theology. And that's where some of this dysfunction is coming out, right? So if, for example, you center the white American experience as the center of theology in the United States, then the shooter is the most important person in this conversation.
Oh, wow.
Right? Because you've spent all this time centering the white male as this is how theology works. This is how the church works. So when we talk about the decline of the church in America, it's actually not true in the Black church. It's not true in the Asian church. It's not true in the Latino churches at all. It's true in the white church. But we've centered whiteness so much that the decline in the white church is seen as the decline of the church, period. And that's what we're doing with the shooter. We're saying his story and his motivation and his, his bad day is more important than the identity of these individuals who were killed. It's more important, than, what they experience is not as important to the victims versus what this person is. And that is a diseased theological imagination that centers a particular perspective. And so part of diluting that toxicity is by decentering these narratives, by actually saying there's a lot more that's going on here. And it's what I've been working on now in my evangelism course, which is the differentiation between truth possessed and truth pursued. Wow. Toxic Christianity tends to be truth possessed. I own the truth. I figured it out. In my hundreds of years of Western theology, I have drawn these boundaries in such a way that I can determine whether you are in and out of those boundaries. And that's truth possessed. I own the truth. Whereas the Bible is really more about truth pursued. Follow Jesus. And we're pursuing Jesus. Now, it doesn't mean there isn't a truth. It just means that there isn't this toxic assumption that this particular version of truth is the definitive version of truth for everybody. And so again, the remedy for that is to pursue the truth together and to hear from our Native American brothers and sisters. Tell us about how you experienced this passage in Scripture and let that inform me. And that's part of a lot of what we can do in education. Expose folks into saying there's a lot of wealth of global Christianity, diverse Christianity, where we can see ourselves not only through this particular lens. And I really do wonder if the shooter himself, this 21-year-old, as we know, grew up in a Southern Baptist church, very much steeped in Christian culture, was, if you read some of the stuff that he would say, I have fallen away from my faith, but I want to rededicate my life. I want to be, that's all very good evangelical language. So he was steeped in the world that we think produces good people. That's been our assumption. Stay within white evangelicalism, we will end up being better people. That's not what happened here. And so the things we have to examine is, I'm sure he got some good teaching along the way. Read your Bible, say your prayers, eat your vitamins. I'm sure he got those good teachings along the way. But did he also inherit a particular form of Christianity that was toxic and that was truth possessed to such an extent that in some ways it gave him permission to do what he ended up doing?
Now we're getting to a place where you're begging questions. You can't go that far. Because the idea then that we have to beg this question, and we'll put it over to the shelf to come back to, is, are we replicating the same discipleship that shaped him in the way that we do discipleship today? That's a big question that we need to ask. We're not going to ask that tonight, but we're going to put that off to the side and ask that again at another night.
Yes.
So I want to take a brief moment, and my technicians will help me. We want to tell you, our audience, this is the time to ask some questions. If you have questions, please post them on Facebook or on YouTube. They will gather them up, and we want to ask these panelists questions that you have. Now, I got some more for them, but I want to get you ready and get you primed for this, okay? So let's go to this next part. This is the part I want to ask you guys. Two things. I'm going to ask you two important questions, and I'm going to go back to you, Jen, and then Sam, and back to Sabrina, and then you, Soong-Chan. The first thing is, do you think this is the end of this kind of violence? That's the first question. And then the second thing is, what can we do to be proactive? How do we build movement? And how do we don't have to wait until the next event. What can we do now in light of the next event to prevent this? So let me start with you, Jen. And in terms of, this is anticipatory self-care for you guys. I know trauma care then deals with the action and the accumulation, but this is anticipatory self-care too, I think, in my mind. So Jen and Sam, tell me where you think about this. Do you think this is the end? Do we have more? And what can we do to be proactive?
It's definitely not the end. And I would say trauma isn't just past and present. There can be trauma in the anticipation of harm. So if your body is always expecting to be hurt or harmed, there's a trauma that happens in that, which I think is what the Asian American community is experiencing now, right? That I as a able-bodied, mid 50-year-old woman, I'm afraid to go to the grocery store, and I can feel that threat in my body every day, and it is creating a certain amount of chronic trauma for me, and we live in a broken, fallen world. So do I think that racism is going to be over at some point? No, I don't. And I think part of the Japanese Americanness in me is that sense of, after the internment, there was a phrase that the Japanese Americans would say, which was shikata ga nai, which is what will be, will be. You just you deal with it and you work harder and life will get better. So there's something in me that I think with the work ethic that I was brought up with that says, like, if I just work hard enough, if I understand what is happening more, if I do more trauma work, if I do my own work, like if I just work, somehow that is going to overcome racism. I think that's not true. We're coming up on Easter, right? It's the death and resurrection of Jesus that is going to overcome racism. And what does that mean in real life? At this point, if you ask me today, I don't know. My body is so dysregulated. I feel like I'm in a sense of, in the trauma world, we call it fracturing, where it just feels like the pieces are not coming together. I don't know cognitively what that means, but in my heart, I believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus. I believe that there will one day be a time when all things will be made right. But I don't see that coming soon. That doesn't mean I don't hope into that I don't desire that or work towards that. But the research has shown Asian American assaults against Asian Americans are way underreported, and they may start to be more reported now. But I don't see that trailing off. With the pandemic and all the economic stress that's going on for people, human nature is we need a receptacle for our own shame, for our own anger, for our own fears. And the non-majority people often are those receptacles for the people in power. And that's certainly true for Asian American women. And so I think the more stress that we feel collectively as a country, I think you'll see the increase and have seen the increase of acts of hate and racism against people. So that wasn't super uplifting, but that's where I'm at right now.
Well, I can tell you right now, just listening to you before Sam comment, you were talking about Black people's life. It's called hypertension and heart disease.
That's right.
And sugar diabetes.
That's right.
We take all that stress you were just talking about, and it manifests death in our body that inflates our blood pressure, and it causes our body not to calibrate food well. And so we live in this tension, what you just talked about. Go ahead, Sam, why don't you answer?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, trauma will just reenact. It will happen again and again and again. And if we don't deal with it in our own body and in our individual and in our community, it just shows up again. So we do need to speak up, and we do need to tell our stories. I think one thing that comes up for me is we often talk about, like, we're in a shame-based kind of culture, and so there's a lot of like caring for yourself is also doing a lot of your identity work and learning about who you are, and really being able to say, do I love my Chinese face? Do I love who I am as a Chinese woman or a Japanese woman? And to say that, not just cognitively, but like really believing that, I think when you have to start to really engage that, you're going to feel some of the traumas in your body. You're going to feel the traumas of your ancestors that are telling you that doesn't give you, often it's silence, and then you just kind of learn about it haphazardly. But it's hard to tell the stories generationally of what has happened. And I think there's also the tension, I think, that both of you spoke to is, there's a part of our culture that tells us, don't stand out. In Chinese, it's called 吃苦, eat your suffering. Like, that's the way to survive. So can we hold the tension that our parents, our generations before us, they had to live a way and operate in a way to survive. And there's some resilience to it that we need to honor. Silence is not always a bad thing. It's a way that actually helps us to engage, and it's a way that we defer to the other. And but it can also be a way to not address what needs to be addressed. So I think it's always being able to hold the both and, yes, Asian Americans, we need to stand up and speak, but can we also honor and understand why silence is a way that we've have generationally, and our ancestors have used it to survive. And to be able to connect to our ancestors, I think there's a lot of, like, our generations before us, well, they don't know what we're going through. They're telling us not to speak, and we almost feel like they're, I think, to speak honestly, you feel ashamed of that. And yet that's having to draw in your kind of the Western part of you that's in you, right? Feeling like, well, my individual voice matters. But then you have the other side telling you what the collective voice matters, and you need to just stay silent. So we're always in this battle of like, who am I? I navigate so many cultures within me, and it's hard to be able to find your voice in it. So I think just being able to know the tension that you're holding, and it's not just your individual story, it's the collective stories that you are also bearing.
It's interesting. You bring up ancestors, and I got to tell you, before we go to Sabrina and Soong-Chan, coming up in Chicago out of a heavy influence Moody Bible Institute, we were told to hate the Catholic traditions and saints and not to be attached to our ancestors, that was wrong. And it was always as dependent upon us and Jesus individually. And I've changed these days. I see that I'm attached to the legacy of my ancestors. Sankofa is the idea that I have to fetch back my past so I can know my present. And I think that's also a part of some toxic theology that
It
we
is.
get that causes us to repress any attachment to our lineage. And I think that's something wrong.
Yeah, and just case in point, like when I was here acculturating and I'm telling my mom, like, I'm really interested in the yin yang sign, my mom would say, oh, no, that's pagan. We don't do that anymore. We're Christians. So in a way, it goes back to like, you need to be Christian first, and everything that's Asian or cultural, it needs to be second.
Exactly. And that's a part of the transformation that's going to, because I can tell you that bifurcation is going to kill us. I think that's almost as painful as the violence externally to us, because we're killing ourselves inside. All right, Sabrina and Soong-Chan, here's where we are. I want to ask you, do you think it's going to change? Do you have hope that it's going to change? And as trainers, both of you, I look at you as trainers of pastors and our future leaders from both college and graduate school. How do you be proactive in your developing and helping to transform people into change agents? How do you do this in your gig? Sabrina, then Soong-Chan, and then we have a question, and I'm going to give an invitation to somebody else.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think it's going to end. Partly because it's been going on for a long time. And, in these days, in this sort of last few years, it's ramped up, of course, but it's been going on a long time. Was recently reminded about a shooting in Stockton that's mostly remembered as a school shooting. 5 children killed, 29 injured, I think, or 30, I can't remember, all Asian. It was a school of mostly Cambodian and I think Vietnamese refugees that in Stockton. And, so that's not even that. It was, I think, 1989, but is only remembered as a school shooting. This stuff keeps happening. In terms of being proactive, I would say one of the critiques I've received over the 20 years or so I've been doing Asian American student ministry is not from everybody, not from all the students, but y'all are talking too much about race. You're talking too much about cultural identity, not enough about Jesus. And I always think, wait, why are you in an Asian American fellowship then? Like, if you don't think there's something we need to investigate here, I always say that nicely. So imagine me saying that nicely. But, I try and respond back like, well, don't you think Jesus cares about you as an Asian American, as whatever your cultural background is? And I think Soong-Chan is what you were saying about cultural captivity that some of us have bought into. And I did for a long time too, right? I was one of those students. Paul Tokunaga came to chapter camp, wanted to gather 5, I think there were maybe 5 Asian American students at camp. And I was like, why? But really what was going on there for me was a lifetime of trauma. When I gather with Asian Americans, people exclude me. I'm more identifiable. I kind of had this idea that like, oh, if I don't hang out with Asian Americans, people won't know I'm Asian, right? Or don't think I'm that kind of Asian, or whatever it was, right? It's a lot of internalized self-hatred. So I was that kind of student, just to say. But I think a lot of that. So trying to help students grasp that. Actually, recently I was at a BIPOC story workshop that a lot of y'all were a part of, helping run, and it was just so helpful because. I've experienced a lot of racial trauma, but I didn't have the categories to sort of like name it. And over the past several years, in this role, I've realized, students aren't just not wanting, they don't want to talk about race because it's painful, right? It's denial, right? Like, it's easier if we don't talk about it, because then I can kind of go in my life like not thinking about it. And I actually had a lot more compassion at that point when I realized that. I had compassion more for myself, right, as a young student, but also just for the folks we're working with now. And so what I think is happening right now, I think that denial is like you almost can't deny it anymore, right? Like a mass shooter shooting 6 Asian women, like driving 30 miles to get to another place to shoot more Asian women. Like you can't deny that. And all those feelings are coming out, all that anger. I preached yesterday on an imprecatory psalm. I accidentally chose an imprecatory psalm that this church was going through, lament psalms. And what was striking me is that as Asian Americans, often, like the others were saying, we aren't aren't as able to express our anger. We stuff that anger. And Brueggemann was saying about the imprecatory Psalms, I was just reading this on Saturday, that they give us, that there's really three things you can do with anger. You could act out on your anger and vengeance, which, you know, we're not supposed to do. You could stuff it or deny it. And he says that you take out your anger then on the people near you, the people around you, your family, maybe. I would say for Asian Americans, we take it out on ourselves, right? Then our self-critique, our, you know, I didn't fit into this box the way they wanted me to, like, you know, all these kinds of things, all that shame, all that anger goes into ourselves. The third thing he says you can do is you can bring it to God, right? And that's what the imprecatory Psalms, he would say, are. You're bringing all that to God. And I think we need to do that. You know, I think as denial goes away and the anger is more revealed, the grief is more revealed, we have to bring that anger to God. And I think, you know, we can learn a lot from our brothers and sisters who have been going on, you know, have been learning that a lot. I've been learning a lot about that from the Black church, you know, for many years. But I think some of that is being proactive. I'm working on a book. 5 of us staff are working on a book for young people and for college students, for Asian Americans, some InterVarsity staff. And I'm writing a chapter with somebody else on racialization. And I think I want to incorporate some of this work on trauma the categories and some of these pieces on anger, because I think without doing that, we just fall back into that cultural captivity. You know, if we don't learn to bring that anger to God, to not just sort of stuff it or be consumed by it, we're just going to go back into that cultural captivity and sort of say, like, deny, deny, deny.
Wow. And Soong-Chan, you're last, but you know, when I started working with InterVarsity before coming to Impact years ago, I had the impression that we were training the next generation of Christians to infiltrate society. You're training the next generation of pastors and people who doing theology. Yeah. Tell me, do you think it's going to switch? And then proactively, what do you think you need to do in your role to help create a new generation of pastors for us?
Yeah.
Because we need some.
Yeah. That's a great question. I will say, maybe kind of jokingly, I think I understand why I'm so short. I've been stuffing all this down for so long. I could be a lot taller if I hadn't been stuffing down. Probably really dense. I'm like, you know, but yeah, that's part of our culture. That's our identity. That's what we were taught. And so that's hard to change, those kind of patterns that we were embedded with as part of our culture, as part of maybe our upbringing. You know, it's hard to change some patterns of thinking and behavior when it is that deeply a part of who you are. And I was really, you know, I have a 20-year-old daughter, and she was 2 when 9/11 occurred. So she doesn't remember that moment, but I remember thinking the world would never be the same for her as a 2-year-old. But then a few years later, my daughter was 17 and she was headed off to college. And she was, some of you know that her college, she goes to Pepperdine, had a mass shooting near the campus. And several of her friends from the freshman class were there, including one of her suite mates. And they got out, but they were there. And one of their classmates, a freshman at Pepperdine, was killed. And I remember I flew out to pick her up and bring her back home to Chicago. And I remember her telling me, I've never had a moment since I was like 10 or 11 years old where I didn't walk into a public space and look around and was afraid of like something happening. And I was like just crushed as a parent to think about that for 10 years of her life. And even now, that's been her way of thinking. And I think what's really devastating about what happened, you know, in Atlanta, and again, I think all of us have alluded to, this was a buildup. This was not just like, you know, some event that came out of nowhere, an isolated incident. This was, as Russell Jung at San Francisco State and many others have documented, there were 4,000 hate crimes that were committed, 4,000 acts of violence against Asian Americans over the last year since the introduction of this language around COVID, you know, the scapegoating of Chinese, you know, Americans and China, just the language around it. And that there was this ongoing growth of violence towards Asian Americans, and then it culminated in it. It wasn't. So we're talking about a lot of learned behavior that has become embedded into the fabric of our society. That's where I'm a little nervous that we start getting into these patterns And it's hard to break those patterns because they have a momentum of their own. And so part of what I think we need to do as teachers, educators, and especially looking for the next generation is to begin to teach new patterns of behavior and thinking. So, I've used this illustration about if something has momentum moving in a particular direction. So think of like a big John Deere tractor trailer tire hollowed out, and it's coming down the hill. You're in the middle of the hill. Your pet is at the bottom of the hill. Your pet's about to get squashed. What you want to do is stop this momentum. And this is the negative momentum we have in our society right now. Violence, divisiveness, racism. This is the momentum that's coming right at us. You as an individual can try to like stop it in its tracks. You'll probably get flattened. It's got too much strength. And I think a lot of us, to be blunt about it, Jimmy, you and I have been in this conversation for decades now. A lot have burnt out and gotten flattened by that momentum and are just exhausted because it keeps happening and it keeps coming at us with full force. And then there are some of us who jumped into the tire to try to stop it from the inside, right? And these were the people who were going to change the system by being part of the system. But what inevitably happens, you get caught up in the momentum of the system and you actually end up adding to the momentum of the system. I've seen this with several of my friends as well, who said, I'm going to change the system from within. And a decade or so later, you're the man now.
Exactly.
You're part of the system now. And so what's the answer? I think and I'm trying to learn this more. I can't stop a narrative with that much momentum and power with like my brute individual strength or my personal, stick-to-itiveness. I've got to create new narratives that go against these broken narratives. If there is a broken narrative, diseased imagination, then I want to create new imagination. If there is a dysfunctional theology that is messed up with toxic Christianity because it's this obsessive truth possessed, then how can I be part of communities that are generating truth pursued, that demonstrate a community of love, a beloved community? That's what King was trying to do, right? That's what others have tried to do. So I think I don't know. I got to a point where I'm an elder statesman now. I'm the old geezer, OG. I'm an old geezer, and so maybe there's a little bit of that crankiness in me. It's like, I don't know if I can change the system. I don't know if I can stop this momentum from picking up more steam, but can I do what I can to generate new momentum? Whether that's with my students, my denomination, and my local church, and my local chapter. I just want to do what I can to generate that new momentum and that new narrative in my communities.
I feel the same way. I don't know if I could stop it, but I need some more reinforcements. Amen. We need some more people out here. So We're not icons. All right. So we got a question, and I want to invite you guys, please, if you can, ask us a question. We got one coming up now from YouTube, and I'm looking on Facebook. I don't see anything over there. Bring some questions over here, but let's have our first one. All right. This is Ellen. Why? I don't know how to spell her last name. Do y'all want to help me on this one? Epifano? Is that it? I think so. Ellen, please forgive me. I did not mean to do this to your last name, but I can say your first name. When someone experiences something traumatic, experts have said that having support from others, being believed, feeling heard, lightens it and can help the person who heal more easily.
Good.
Are you able to provide examples of us doing that for each other?
Yeah.
I'm gonna let all four of you guys go after that
one. I'll jump in because this just happened to me very recently, and I will say that the ones who seemed to get it and immediately offered support were Black and brown women. That was the first line of defense for me, Black and brown women. And it came out through like meals. Oftentimes it was meals. Wow. It was anonymous delivery. I found out later it was one of my former students, an African-American woman who sent my family, food. Another person who made food for all the Asians in the North Park community and hand delivered it. And that was just this empathy, first of all, knowing I know what you're experiencing. And sometimes the best language that I could offer is the language that I know, in which case this was food. And I wrote an email to one of them because And I talked about my mom's passing and my mom being in the service industry and how that really kind of hit home and really, the pain of that was felt. But there was something healing about chicken wings, mainly because that was my mom's specialty when she worked at the inner city carryout. So, it was a real treat when she would bring that home after work, and it would be like late at night, but she would bring that home as a special treat. Like every month or so I would get a special treat of chicken wings when I was in high school. Even when I came back from college, that was what she would make sure I would have as my first meal home. And so for this African American woman who didn't know this story at all to send deliver a box of chicken wings, I was crying as I'm eating these wings, and there was something healing about somebody gets this. Somebody understands that, they're not trying to fix it. They're not trying to explain it. They're not trying to write a theological treatise on it. They just understand you're in pain, and the way I'm going to connect to you is by offering something that is from my culture, my heart, and just bring it to your doorstep. And I'm tearing up now, just, thinking about what that meant to me personally, just the healing that it brought.
Wow. Can we get one more story? Because we have another question. I want to get these people on their toes. Go ahead. Somebody else answer that last question. Y'all need to see it again?
I can jump in.
Go ahead.
I think for us, Asian American Ministries were part of InterVarsity, and last year, I think it was after Ahmaud Arbery, we were I was in a department meeting with some of my staff, and we just felt like, we just want to record a short video, super short, like 1 minute, expressing support for the Black staff. And I sent it to Shaylin, the director of Black Campus Ministries for InterVarsity, and said, hey, we thought we recorded this. If you think it's good enough to share with them, please do. Just wanted to share a word of encouragement and prayer and solidarity. And then, kind of fast forward even to in February, so before the shooting, BCM sent us a letter back saying, you acknowledged this last year. We really appreciated it. And in the midst of anti-Asian elder violence, they were saying, we see you. It wasn't being reported in the mainstream media. They were saying, we see you, and we want you to be able to take space you need to sort of because it's because of the whole like black-white binary of race in America, the Asian American story, the Latino stories, Native stories aren't often, the media doesn't see those, right? And so they were saying, hey, take the space. We know it's not being reported, but take the space on your teams with InterVarsity. We see you and we want to support you in that. And that meant the world. That meant the world to our staff team. Feeling seen by the Black community, especially.
Wow.
So
that does mean a lot. There's a scripture. This is Holy Week. It says, blessed are those who are mourn, for they will be comforted. And I think one of the most exciting reasons why I'm still a Christian today, for a lot of reasons why I could not be, is that Jesus gets it. And he's not distanced from this. And so he's the answer to the very question that Ellen asked. Let's get the second question up. Is there a way forward for Asian American Christians to participate in a faith that is free from impact from evangelicalism? How are each of you finding hope in these rough times? All right, I'm going to let my therapist jump in now, because I'm not going to let them get away just looking at us now. So Jen and Sam, y'all can start, and then one of you, and then we'll go after Soong-Chan Rah and Sabrina.
I think that's a heavy question. I think a lot of it is in the beginning is to just realize how much like our story has not been told. Our history, the Christian history, doesn't include us. So I think a lot of the beginning point is, can you start to see where your story is erased? And can you start to even consider looking at, like, are there Asian theologians? I think one of the hard parts when I was in seminary, when I realized that, wait, my story doesn't connect here. I had a hard time finding resources that are connected to like authentic Asian indigenous expressions of faith. And yet, a lot of this field is kind of in the academia world, and it doesn't get to translate into stories because a lot of the immigrant churches, a lot of the ethnic specific churches still have a pretty Western paradigm that they came out of. So there's a lot of grief to have to unravel, to see like, wow, there's stuff out there. There are connections that we can to engage our identity and engage something that feels connected to our Asian American expression. But it does take that work to find theologians, poets, musicians, artists that are giving us that expression.
Wow.
I'll just start there.
Good. Someone else.
I mean, you can probably tell by my face, like that's just a hard, painful question. You know, my grandfather was a Presbyterian minister. He's one of the first. He built a Japanese American church after World War II here in Chicago, and you know, and it had its Japanese service and it had its white service, and it felt very austere and Presbyterian to me in some ways, that I think there was so much about loving the Word of God that is still so important to me. I think that's why I love story, and that's why I do the work that I do around story and what it means to bring my Japanese American woman's story to the story, the good news of the gospel. But there's been so many barriers in between, and I think because of that white-centeredness that Professor Rah has been talking about, that I automatically defer to the white expert. And that's how I've learned who Jesus is often, was by listening to, the evangelical white male pastor who seemed to have all the answers. And so how do I kind of unravel from that and hold on to the parts of that are good, and I think did reflect something of the kingdom of God to me, and then how do I release and let go of the things that were not true, or were not reflective of the Jesus that I think I'm getting to know more and more. And that's hard, right? And for me, it's also connected to family, and so that adds a whole nother layer on top of that, in terms of my own ancestors. And recent studies have come out that Christian nationalism is one of the biggest predictors of xenophobia. And how do you separate Christian nationalism from white evangelicalism? That also just feels really complicated. So I don't know. I mean, it's a process. I think it goes back to what I was saying in the beginning of having some kindness for the complexity of my story and all the intersections of all these different things, and allowing myself to go slowly to find different faces, different voices, and have those conversations and pray. I mean, I'm asking Jesus to show himself to me. I'm asking the Spirit to hold and surround and inform me. I'm asking the Father to come and speak to me in ways that I, in my Japanese American woman's story and body, need to hear in particularity. And I love the story in Mark 5 of Jesus stopping the crowd and making room for the woman with the issue of blood to just come and tell her story. It's not this huge theological, complicated church moment. He's like, come tell me who you are. And, it says she tells the whole truth of her story. And there's something in that interaction of bringing the whole truth of our story to a Jesus who is willing to stop everything for us and hear our particular story in our particular body, in our particular language, with our particular face. In a culture that doesn't want to see us and doesn't want to hear us, that I think brings a sense of healing. At least for me, has brought a sense of hope when I've had those moments, and I have, and I'm deeply grateful for them. But for me, they've actually not happened in a Sunday service, and that doesn't mean I don't love church or want to go to church, but it's having imagination for meeting Jesus in some unconventional places that I think has opened me up to something bigger and deeper and wider of what the Trinity or who the Trinity really is.
Mhm. We got a couple more questions. This next question, we don't have to post it, but I'm going to answer it. And it's, I want to say as part of the impact movement, the scripture gives us encouragement to mourn with those who mourn. But also sometimes in our humanity, we make mistakes in our greatest efforts. And some people have asked, well, where is the South Asian community? And tonight they're not represented. I can take ownership because I'm the one that invited guests tonight, but I can take ownership in saying that I probably messed up. No, I can't say I probably. That's a wrong word. I did mess up. And I do apologize to my South Asian brothers and sisters. One of the men that I love the most and is one of my fiercest mentors is South Asian. And so I do apologize for not having that population represented, and I'll do better next time. I won't make the same mistake twice. That's one thing my mom and dad would tell you, that when I got spankings and whippings as a kid, I at least didn't get it for the same thing twice. So I'm going to learn from this and I'll do better. We got one more question because it's already 1:16. Can we have this other question that showed up too for our panel? And then we're going to try to close it out. Lamarcus R. Cook, he said, question, as Asians in the U.S., what is important that we teach and learn about you and the Asian community? Excellent. So this is a Black man, I presume a pastor or some kind of teacher. What is important that we teach about the Asian American community within our world? Soong-Chan, why don't you take a shot at it, and then I'll let somebody else jump in too.
Sure. I think you kind of alluded to it a little bit in very gracious apology. Thank you for pointing that out for us, that Asia is a pretty big continent, right? I mean, there's a lot going on. And the focus tends to be on what we call CJK, the Chinese, Japanese, Korean experience, the Far East, East Asian experience. Southeast Asian is oftentimes, ignored, or South Asian. Sometimes we forget that the ancient Near East or that Arabic nations are also oftentimes considered Asian as well. So on like census surveys, there's actually the category, and then of course Pacific Islanders. So I think it's recognizing that this is a vast cultural, racial, even the racial categories within Asian communities. And so I think just the effort to get to know this wide range is a good first step to say, I can't just assume I know everything about Asian culture because I watch Bruce Lee movies or because I saw Minari, which is a great movie, by the way, but it's still within a particular cultural context.
Mm-hmm.
And there's universal elements of it, obviously, but just to try to understand the real wide breadth and depth of our culture. And I just to kind of add to the other question that was being asked about how do we maybe rebuild our theology after we deconstruct it? And I think that's one of those things that I think is good to do. As a professor, one of the things I do is I deconstruct things. I take them apart and I, rip things to shreds and then, tear apart arguments and the like. But there's really a joy to constructing together. And so I think in the Asian American community, we do need to deconstruct our captivity to Western culture. Sometimes we need to deconstruct our own cultural dynamic of like growing up in a Korean immigrant family. There are some things that make me uniquely Korean. And I need to deconstruct that to say which is of God, which is not. But then I want to be part of that construction. And so if there's something that I was made in the image of God, not in the image of a white male. I was made uniquely as a Korean American male. And that means that my contribution to the beloved community is going to be unique. And so I think if there's something that can be said, recognize that the contribution that Asian Americans and the specificity out of which are come, that's going to be the unique contribution that we can make as well.
Yeah. Excuse me for doing something I shouldn't as a host, but I want to do this part. Maybe I can redeem my mistake I made before. But some years ago, when I was on staff in InterVarsity, I was the director of the Atlanta Urban Project. Actually, where I live now is site to one of the places before gentrification happened. And as we eventually created 2 or 3 sites, but one of the things as I would matriculate and drive through the neighborhood, I started seeing Asian Americans come through my community. And so what I wanted to do was to find out who they were. They didn't work at a Chinese restaurant. And what I later discovered was that they were Vietnamese and that they were migrating from the South, coming through my neighborhood, and eventually relocating in the Chambly area. And from that, I didn't know anything about Vietnamese outside of the war when I saw my cousins and neighbors go. And I started befriending the Atlanta Chinese Christian Church. They brought me into Asian Square, introduced me to not only Vietnamese food, but Vietnamese people. And the last 2 years of that urban project, we did a day camp for 125 Vietnamese children in the Chambly area. So we had Black kids in the hood, like we were doing. We had some Latinos and Asians, but I could tell you what really can help us in this whole process of teaching is just seeing people and asking their story, just seeing them. Like one of the words I've been working, you wouldn't believe this, all last night, I was coming up with a different word other than BIPOC because I don't like it. Because it's Black, Indigenous, people of color. And I said, well, there's people missing in this piece. So I started playing with Spanish in my mind, Blanco for Black, Latino, Asian, Indigenous networks and communities so that we can get all of us together in this space instead of assuming when we say BIPOC that those not named will be included. And I would say for all of our brothers and sisters, and what keeps me in this work today is a natural curiosity to meet God's creation. And so, brother, when you're asking about the Asian story, I think the onus is not only hearing how they have the story, but us to have the guts and the risk to move out of our spaces to realize everybody don't eat egg rolls and chow mein, and to find kimchi and bulgogi and sushi and understand the difference between Cantonese and Mandarin and languages and the variety and the eclectic nature. So if we could take a risk, I think we'll be healthy for everybody. We got 8 minutes to go. So I want to give some closing comments to my panelists. So we're leaving now. We're at the cusp. I know that panelists didn't answer, but I got one more question for them before they close out. It's Holy Week. It's a week of trauma, if we're really, really honest. And since we're in this week and we got a little ways before Monday, Thursday, and Easter, from each of you, what hope do you get out of this week for what happened March 16th? And what hope, if you're reflecting on this, can you share with our audience? And you can go one at a time. Ladies can go first. Sabrina, Reverend Sabrina Chan, and then Jen, and then Sam and Soong-Chan.
So you're asking what out of Holy Week?
Yes. This experience this week, do you have any hope coming out of this? And what that hope is that you can share with everyone else?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think earlier when we were talking about what brings us hope, as we were talking about cultural captivity and some of those things, I think about our staff and students that I know, and that connects for me to Maundy Thursday, Jesus, and having a meal with his friends, and I think what gives me hope is, I don't know if we'll ever be free from the impact of white evangelicalism. That feels like a big imagination. But what gives me hope is, we've got some staff going through what we call a practical theology cohort that centers on justice. And in that space, staff are getting to read and try and construct in an Asian American space. What are we thinking about? How can we try some experiments on campus with students that can do that, some of that work? this last week or to the week before, I think it was the week of the shooting at Baylor, our student leaders there organized a vigil on campus at Baylor, which is not a very friendly place for Asian Americans, I would say. I used to go up there to help the Asian Fellowship there, and I'm just really proud of them for advocating for their community, for leading out in that. So, you know, in the midst of Holy Week, thinking about times the disciples totally didn't get it, right? Even after, you know, at the meal on Monday, Thursday, and then going into Good Friday, they failed dramatically, right? Leaving Jesus. I should say the men failed dramatically. Let me just be clear. The women stayed at the cross. So, you know, I got to say that. And the women were there on Sunday morning. So I'm sorry for erring there. But that gives me hope, you know, that we don't have it all right now. And maybe we should follow the lead of the women. I feel a little bit, you know, I don't know what the word is, but I probably shouldn't say that since I'm a woman. But, you know, if you're looking at the disciples, but that gives me hope that we can learn and grow and keep trying in community, you know.
Okay. Jen?
There's two things that come to mind immediately for me. I mean, one is the story about the grandma who kind of beat off the guy who was trying to assault her, and then gave the $1 million back to her community. Like, didn't hesitate, wasn't a thought. That gives me hope. And I think the other thing is, I think like our partnership with you, Jenny, that I think there's something about the BIPOC, because I don't have a better way of kind of saying that, that community coming together, that there's a cohort of believers, of people who are decentering whiteness by coming together and not letting whiteness pit us against one another, or using whiteness as the standard, and then we all have to jockey for position in terms of being able to get what that we think that whiteness can give us. And I think, you know, just the partnership that like I've had with you, Jimmy, I think gives me a lot of hope around what it means for us to come together and learn what it means to love one another and follow Jesus together. I mean, I think, you know, in the mess of that Last Supper, where people are fighting and talking about like who's going to betray, who's not, and like it's a mess. But there's something about, yeah, the death and resurrection of Jesus that kind of like, yeah, that's hopeful. So those are the two things.
All right, Sam, and then Soong-Chan.
Thank you. I think the passage that comes to me, and I want to tie this into also our physical body and the trauma that we experience. I go to Micah 6:8, and it's do justice, but it's not just do justice only. It's to love mercy and to walk humbly with our God. So let me connect this to fight, flight, freeze. If we're always, if we're freezing, we need to activate. So we need to actually do justice. We need to step in. If you've never been to a rally, go to a rally, go to a vigil. You need to have that communal resonance and response, because it allows your body to move out of the freeze state when you do justice. But if you want to love mercy, you got to also know that you need to take care of yourself. So those that, you know, default to justice, do you know how to take care of yourself? Do you know what mercy is? Can you step into nourishment and loving mercy and taking care of yourself? I think a lot of the talk around food, I think there's something nourishing. I'm reclaiming when my parents say, have you eaten yet? As only expression of love, to say, like, I think there's some wisdom around that we need to be able to take care of our bodies and know what's nourishing for us. Instead of just making spaghetti, Like me and my family, we decided to make dumplings like how my dad made it. And it took a long time. And I realized the rigor of making dumplings takes a long time, but there's something of that connects me to my culture, that makes me actually feel like that is healing when I love myself and love some of the mercy that I need to experience. And when I think of walk humbly, it is, so rest is, fighting against fight. Flight is that you need to stretch yourself. You need to learn what you don't know. You need to move. You need to learn about other racism of other cultures and expand your understanding, so you don't stay in your enclave of your cultural heritage. We need to learn from our African American brothers and sisters as well. And so stretching allows you to expand who you are and actually be able to embody more. And I go back to what's the other question around, what do you need to know about Asian? Like it's a huge thing. And I think for myself, it'll take more than 5,000 lifetimes for me to understand the 5,000 history of my Chinese culture. So we can't be experts at every culture, but we can start to dismantle how white supremacy has taken away our imagination and actually made us actually live out the racism against against each other. So when you start to unlock that, then you get to be curious, as Jimmy said, and learn something. It doesn't have to be everything, but start to learn something to see the differentiation, distinction, and the beautiful diversity expressions of our image of God that's in so many of our faces. So that's what I'll say.
Wow, that's a good word, Sam. All right, Professor Rah, close out.
So I get the last word, and my last word is for Holy Week. Who gets the last word? It's not the shooter. It's not the politicians. The Sunday school answer of Jesus is almost always right. And so who gets the last word? Jesus gets the last word. And that is very hopeful.
That's true. That is a good word. One of the things that our master, instructed us to do, which I think is the hardest part of our litmus test, is not doctrine, it's actually loving each other. And one thing that we're learning is that we fail in doing that often. And the impact movement, we're trying to know, and we need to help people understand an ethnic specific ministry doesn't mean that we're myopic, that we really take seriously how to love each other and then therefore how to love everyone else too. And so this is the impact movement, not Jimmy McGee's expression of reaching out our love for our Asian brothers and sisters to say, we're here with you and we love you and we want to be with you. I respect each of you on this call. I've asked it before, and again, South Asian brothers and sisters, please forgive me. I won't make that mistake twice. And we pray right now, in order for us, if this beloved community, if the kingdom of God is going to come, it won't come because we've been passive. It's going to come because we're engaged and not only listening to each other's story, but standing up for each other in our stories. And I want to thank each of you for being with us tonight, long night of Holy Week. So Sabrina and Jen and Sam and Soong-Chan, love, grace, peace to you, your families, to your communities. And may this Holy Week really, really penetrate your life. And hopefully tonight's program would penetrate all of our guests as well. So I want to say thank you again for this night. I want to tell everybody else we're coming back soon. And we're going to do our next real talk is going to be decentering whiteness to centering on Jesus. And what kind of imagination does that take? So I got some guests I'm putting together. I think you're going to like it. And I hope you'll join us. But in the meanwhile, enjoy this Holy Week. Every day, every moment, breathe in life. Love our Jesus. Don't skip over Saturday. Saturday is very important because if you skip over Saturday, Sunday is just a moment. You got to live in this Saturday. I want to say good night to you and good night to the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Good night.